and we're recording. Hi, Danny.
Hello. How you doing?
It's nice to meet you. First and foremost, let me thank you personally and on behalf of the Ethan and Trader Ethereum community for making the time. It's really nice to sit down. For people who don't know the series, we use community input. Questions get asked and upvoted by the community. And today I'm happy to talk to Danny Ryan and go over the Ethereum 2.0, the testnet staking questions. We have about two major themes. Three, the phases 0 to 2, then the phase 0, 1, and 2, then staking centralization will be another theme, and then timing and some miscellaneous questions around that. But before we dive into the questions, Danny, could you introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do at the Ethereum Foundation?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me. I'm a longtime lurker of Eth2.0 and eFinance, and every once in a while a contributor. But I don't have the shit posting skills like y'all do. Joking. Anyway, so I'm Danny Ryan. I work with the Ethereum Foundation. I work on primarily on Eth2, like all like core protocol stuff. I do some research, I do some spec writing, testing, and a lot of coordination on the project in general. So I spend a lot of time working with clients, making sure they understand things, working through problems, testing out clients, and all sorts of fun stuff. And I also spend some time communicating with people. I guess part of the question is why. I opened it up and went down the rabbit hole and kind of can't get out of it. I mean, that's the simple answer. More so, I'm a bit of a Luddite. And I talk about this every once in a while, but I'm a Luddite in the sense that I'm concerned about the trajectory of technology in society, and specifically due to the behemoth powers of the government and large corporations that are increasingly controlling society and controlling us, quite frankly, especially with social media and advertising and that kind of stuff. So anyway, I don't know if blockchain is going to be a panacea to solve all of these things, but it's a chance to disrupt the trajectory and to disrupt the powers that be, and hopefully find a better, more equitable equilibrium for the trajectory of individuals in society. So that's kind of why I'm here. I'm also just super, super fascinated with the technology. Someone mentioned the other day, it's like an XKCD. It's like the ultimate nerd sniping. You gave this problem that combines software engineering and economics and game theory and stuff, and it's once you open it up, it's impossible to put down.
What were you doing before you started working on Ethereum?
For many years, I was just kind of a freelance developer. I had various clients, built some web applications, built some database optimizations, did some AI analysis stuff for some people, just kind of all over the place, figuring out how to make ends meet while not having to go into an office has been my primary goal, and I'm still achieving it, working with the Ethereum Foundation.
All right, Danny, then let's just dive into the questions, and let me extend a thank you to everyone who posted those and upvoted them. I'll just read the username and then I'll ask a question. I hope I pronounced them correctly. So Gimli, the ETH Maxi, asked a couple of questions. I'll just read them. So if phase 0 is basically done, just making sure that all it works smoothly over the coming months, and phase 1 is being worked on, what are the chances phase 1 is ready as soon as phase 0 mainnet is released? In other words, do we get phase 0 and phase 1 within a couple of months of each other?
There's a lot of work going on in phase 1 right now. We're in this phase where it's spec refinements and a bunch of spec testing and initial prototyping. So we do have a number of individuals from the different client teams that are doing some basic prototypes and kind of doing this feedback loop with the spec. And that's something that we did for a long time, quite frankly, with phase 0. Phase 1, this feedback loop, I expect to take a lot shorter amount of time because a lot of the core is in place. Phase 0 really provides the baseline architecture for everything else. And really, most of the heavy lifting happens in this system, this core system that we built out in phase 0. And so I expect this feedback loop to take a little less time, and I expect the development to take a lot less time, primarily because I guess of a few things. One, the client teams are at this point experts at building ETH2, and this is, rather than building ETH2, this is like extending the base, the strong base that's already built. And it's also, in terms of specification, a lot of the major design decisions have been made and had to be made with phase 0. And so plugging in these new components with phase 1, writing the extension of the network spec, writing the extension of the validator spec, these are not Herculean tasks as they were in phase 0. And so I don't expect phase 1 to be ready right after phase 0 is launched. One of the reasons is that just a lot of the engineering effort and a lot of the engineering and the very expert resources on these client teams are spending night and day on phase 0. And so although they do have some people working on phase 1 at this point, they don't have most of the resources. And so once we do go into production, there's going to be maintenance, there's going to be issues, keeping things kind of moving and live. But I expect like a large portion of teams to really shift into like full blown phase 0 engineering effort at that point. And so I think we're going to have prototypes. I think we might even have like small little nets and stuff in the coming months through the summer. But the priority and the main focus of all the engineering effort is phase 0 right now.
Okay, cool. So it automatically picked it up?
Yeah. This is great.
Perfect. Okay, great.
All right.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah, we'll just continue, and I'll just.
I'm gonna get you. Your voice is coming out of my computer. I'm gonna get you to run through my headphones. Give me 1 second.
All right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's much better. Is everything fine for you?
Yeah. I'm good to go now. Sorry, I had to scramble real quick, but I think we're good.
No, it's great. I'm happy I asked the question. I'll just leave the first part in, and I'll cut this piece out, and we'll just continue from here. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So, second question, you already touched on it briefly, but the second question is, how is work on phase 1 going? I don't know if there's a good measurement of progress. I don't know which kind of measurement you'd like to use, but how would you answer the question?
Right. So we're in the as I mentioned before, we're in this process where we're in kind of a feedback loop between clients and specification. And this is, I think Terrence from Prismatic is doing some build out. There's a great issue he just posted. He's kind of built out the core and has a bunch of feedback, just kind of like refinements, minor bug fix here and there. So the Prismatic team is building on it. I know the Lighthouse team is following the spec. I don't think they've built anything yet. Mikhail, who was previously Harmony and is on TXRX, which is a consensus kind of R&D team. He's in the process of building out phase 1 on top of Teku. And so there's a lot of hands touching it, but these are like individuals rather than massive teams, or the whole team building on it. Because as I said before, most engineering efforts really like focused on shipping the phase 0 stuff, which I think is it's the right balance. I would love to have a few more engineers touching this, and I think that's kind of the general plan over the next couple months, is to have more and more people focusing on this. One interesting and fun thing is that Mikhail, if you check out ETH Research, he's been working on this like phase 1.5 stuff a little bit, and specification of that which we can talk about later, is the integration of ETH1 under the new ETH2 consensus. He is this is like the pairing of an ETH2 client and ETH1 client, and Geth is working on the modification of Geth to defer its consensus to ETH2, and in parallel, Mikhail's building out the other side of that. So actually during the summer, I expect to see some phase 1.5 prototypes out. So there's good movement, and there's a lot of eyes on this, and a small amount of engineers, and that over the next 3-4 months, that'll shift into like large teams working on it.
Why is ETH only redeemable after phase 2? That's a hell of a long time, and I would be much more comfortable with it being redeemable after phase 1. Is this due to technicalities or just a decision that was made due to other incentives?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And this is one that I think is going to be a part of the conversation for a while until it just changes. So their transfers were part of the spec, part of the phase 0 spec early on, with the intention of probably having the number of transfers allowed per block to be 0 to start. This was like a safety mechanism. It's really like
Wait, with transfers,
yeah.
You mean a bidirectional transfer?
This would be validator to validator transfers.
Oh, okay.
So this is not bidirectional, and it would enable liquidity for a validator early on. Say I'm done. Probably an exchange would make a validator account and be like, you can sell it, you can send it to me, and now sell it. There's obviously, in the time being when the kind of the new ETH2 consensus is being built and Ethereum's kind of chugging along, and these two things are separate, it's very nice, right? Like it gives validators an out, it gives liquidity, and reduces some of the like time horizon risk in getting involved in this. There were a couple things here. First of all, the intention was to not have transfers at day 0, but maybe some amount of months in to enable the transfers. This would be to allow us to more easily coordinate in the event that something bad happens at the very start. Once there's transfers, it's much more difficult to kind of come together and say, let's patch this thing up. Because all of a sudden there's liquidity and money's kind of exiting and moving around in the system. And then there was this transfer mechanism was, I wouldn't call it a kludge exactly, but it was not a very sophisticated transfer mechanism. And there was a bug found. This is probably like 10 months ago now, but there was a bug found. There was the intention of not enabling them initially, and so they're removed from the spec. So that if and when validator transfers were integrated natively, we'd do it right and roll it out, in a fork after phase 0. This is also when the spec was in this kind of like freezing phase, and before we unfroze it, when we made some modifications to phase 1. There's another reason that transfers are not currently integrated, and that is because of this whole notion and confusion and issue between like, is ETH2 a new asset, an emergent asset? What are the tax implications? Are there going to be two Ethereums, Ethers traded? And once you enable liquidity on ETH2 without fungibility with the Ether on ETH1, a bidirectional bridge or an integration of ETH1 and ETH2, you've guaranteed to trade two tokens on exchanges. And so between some of the technical risk, between this notion of kind of uncertainty on what it means for there to be two tokens, at least for the time being, the intention is to wait until there's a bidirectional bridge or a full integration to support liquidity for the validators on ETH2. This is obviously like a tough pill to swallow in some respects because there's an unknown time horizon, and because we want to encourage the community, want to encourage validation. And so from one angle, this could be a boon for hobbyists, for like holders, true believers, people that are in it for, this multi-year time horizon, that don't really care if their ETH's locked. If I'm going to hold for 5 years, then if my ETH's locked for a year, whatever. Maybe there will be fewer people that validate at the start because of this. But if you are one of those people that are validating at start, you're going to receive higher rewards because of the way that the distribution mechanism works, and that it does scale with respect to the amount of ETH that's total validating. I will say that this is complicated. There's not really a right answer. Certainly phase 0 is going to launch without transfers, but after phase 0 launches, we're going to have a whole host of users. Like the people on ETH Finance, the community members, the institutional providers, all these people, they're going to be a class of users, and they're going to have demands. And I think that this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And depending on the path and the expected timelines on the integration of ETH1 into the new ETH2 consensus, which would provide this like point at which you could add liquidity. Depending on that time horizon, I think that it's likely that the demand could be such that the community wants transfers and the community gets transfers. This will be a conversation, I think, over the next 6 to 8 months as things launch and as people kind of get in there. But just know that liquidity is certainly coming. It can come in the form of validator transfers, or it can come in the form of the integration of ETH1 into ETH2. There are some trade-offs on which path is taken, both in terms of time, in terms of like technicals, and in terms of like some strange emergent new asset legal risk, not necessarily legal risk, but just like, processing the implications of like having these systems be disjoint while there's also liquidity. So yeah, I'm not super pleased with the trade-off here, but I wouldn't necessarily be super pleased in the other direction either. So it's a tough one.
Non-native and non-dev here, so I hope I'm using the correct formulation. But would one of the key metrics be the initial? I guess we need about 500 to 600,000 ETH to kickstart the phase 0. So would that be a key metric to check whether or not the hobbyists and the long holders have an appetite for a bidirectional bridge?
I mean, check for in which respect, whether that amount actually comes up or not. Deposits
and how quickly it comes up.
Yeah, I mean, if we can't hit that number, like say the deposit contract launches and the genesis date is set for 5 weeks after. If we don't hit that number by genesis date, then that's certainly a signal that something is off, right? That's a signal that potentially the balance between potential rewards and risk is not palatable to the people that we expected it to be palatable for. And so certainly if those numbers aren't hit in a reasonable time frame, that is a signal for opening up the dialogue and discussing the options in terms of modified issuance, modified some of the technicals, et cetera. So I honestly don't expect that. I know kind of firsthand there's a lot of people really, really itching to get involved, kind of no matter what. But we'll see. If those numbers can't be hit, there'll definitely be a signal.
Yeah, I'm asking specifically because I noticed that from a community perspective or member perspective, it's sometimes hard to follow the exact engineering and progress, but it's easy to keep some key metrics, and that's why I was thinking like the speed or the progress that would be made with the ETH that's being deposited. If it turns out that, say, there's a 5-week window and like the site to DAI migration, and it just goes quickly, then that would be a clear signal that the incentives are more or less aligned.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And with the Launchpad infrastructure that I think it was announced at Ethereal and is going to be discussed more in a blog post really soon, there'll be a really clean and easy way to kind of monitor that. Also with these block explorers, there's also like increasingly good tools to check out deposits and kind of keep an eye on things. So that'll be a really fun and exciting time and a really interesting time if no deposits are made.
Last question from Gimli, because he had another question on staking centralization, but a few people asked questions similarly, and I'll just keep that for later. His last question is: how does Vitalik currently participate to phase 0? Is he actively working or just sticking to a research role?
Vitalik, eats, sleeps, breathes Ethereum. If you've ever had the pleasure to spend any amount of time with him, it's hard to get him to turn off. It's what he cares about. It's what he's excited about. It's what he loves. And so in that capacity, I think he does everything that he can to make Ethereum better and to ship Ethereum. But also that said, he's a researcher. He's not an engineer, and phase 0 is, not to discredit him, he can write some great code, but that's just not what he does with his time. the phase zero is largely an engineering problem right now. And so, yes, Vitalik is a part of conversations. We have meetings with him every week where we talk about, any number of things related to phase 0, 1, and 2. But he also spends a ton of time like researching deep crypto and thinking about long-term vision and all sorts of stuff. And so, I think he's involved with phase zero as much as is reasonable, but he's also spends a lot of time looking towards the future.
Dispels42 asks, early in phase 0 planning, the view was that phase 1 was quote unquote the easiest of the 3 phases. Why is that? And is that still the view? Sorry, I didn't read the full question. And also, please comment on this from both a spec design perspective and in terms of implementation relative to phase 0 implementation.
Right. So phase 0 is hard. Phase 0 is hard in the sense that it manages most of the sophisticated machinery of the system. The consensus mechanism with a ton of validators. Eth2 is designed in such a way that not only is it a sophisticated consensus mechanism, but it's a sophisticated consensus mechanism that can handle hundreds of thousands of validators. And the reason that we need hundreds of thousands of validators because we do random sampling of these validators into smaller committees across the entire system, across all the different shards. And so the job of integrating and building this phase 0 core consensus mechanism is difficult. But most of the bones are in place, and most of the software kind of serves as the scaffolding for the rest of the system. The notion of managing validators and controlling different subsections and committees and coming to consensus on things in general is largely complete in phase 0. Whereas in phase 1, it's really plugging the notion of shard chain into this. And so there are some consensus challenges. So some of these like core state transition challenges in just like plugging in what a shard chain is and plugging in how it gets linked into the beacon chain, and extending what a validator has to do to not only follow this beacon chain, but to run over to a shard chain and add that component, that shard block, into their attestation. But it's not an order of magnitude increase. It's not even like doubling the complexity in my opinion. It's probably, I don't have the right estimate. I'll ask an engineer. But some of the complexities lie in the networking stack, but even then, most of the networking stack is kind of in place. This notion of like sharding the actual network layer and these like subnets that validators join, this all happens in phase 0. There just aren't shard blocks flying around yet. And so I do think that phase 1 is less complex than phase 0. I also think that the client teams are experts at this point. A lot of what they've done in the past 12 to 24 months has been not only building this out, but becoming experts at building this out, understanding the system, architecting these systems, making them more modular and extensible, and just kind of getting them into very professional areas. And so I do expect the complexity to be much less for phase 1. In terms of phase 2, so there's a lot of phase 2 is the abstract, like just general notion of adding execution on top of this like highly scalable data layer. Phase 1.5 is likely, I mean like 99% almost certainly the first thing to happen, which is the integration of ETH1, or the integration of the current Ethereum chain to live under the ETH2 consensus as a single shard. And this certainly has complexities, but probably doesn't even have as many complexities as like this generally open phase 2 thing where there's execution across all shards. The reason that I think people talk about the complexity of phase 2 is because there's just so many different paths and design decisions that can happen here. And so like the past 12 months, teams like the EWASM team, teams like the Quilt team, members of my team, and TXRX, all sorts of like they've spent so much time exploring the breadth of what a phase 2 could be, right? And there's so many ways that you could architect execution on top of this system, and so part of the complexity there is just narrowing down what is the appropriate path there.
How do you guys come to consensus on deciding what path to take?
That's we hash it out time and time again. If you check out ETH Research, there's tons of posts. I think that one of the guiding lights, especially on the phase 1.5 and execution, is that ETH2 is Ethereum and is for the community of Ethereum, is for the dApps, the contracts, the everything that's already built on Ethereum. ETH2 should be an upgraded context for that and an extensible context for that. And so taking that as the guiding light, I think probably 12 months ago, that was less the guiding light and more the guiding light was just understanding all of the possibilities. Whereas I think today, much more so, the guiding light is ETH2 is for the existing community and the existing technology. And that, I think that guiding light has allowed us to narrow down, one of the core things is like Ethereum today should be able to exist almost transparently under this new consensus, and any additional execution on shards should be able to interop and work well with existing Ethereum today. And so that has allowed us to narrow down quite a bit.
Yeah. Does that imply that the ETH1 or the current Ethereum is actually mature enough that we've seen quite enough exploration and dApp development? And is that what implies? Is that because we have a couple of questions related to that later on. So when you say that the view you're taking is narrowed based on what Ethereum 1.0 delivers right now, does that imply that the ecosystem right now is mature enough to actually just use this as a starting point and then continue that way?
I guess it implies that, well, one, I think the community is increasingly mature. What is built on it is increasingly mature, and what is built on is increasingly valuable. And something that, like, throwing out some core design decisions to break everything is it's just not in the cards. I think what is powerful about it is the momentum, and we have to steward the momentum. Actually, Joe Lubin put it great, I think, on a podcast the other day. He said, like, this is it's like an operating system upgrade. You upgrade your operating system, things are hopefully more secure. You potentially added some new RAM, so you can run more things. And if you had an application, it probably just continues to run. But if you're a developer, you might have like a new suite of tools. You might have new gadgets and new things that you can do in this new upgraded context. So, like, although the things continue to run and continue to exist on this new OS, you now have like a new playground, an extended playground to play on. And so that's the goal here, is to enable the existing Ethereum community while at the same time providing a new and upgraded environment to grow into over time. And so that, I think, framing it like that is, one, very healthy. Two, is supportive of the existing community, and also just kind of gives us the right context to really begin to evaluate decisions that happen in the user layer.
ETH49F asks, in ETH 2.0, how will DeFi projects be distributed across at least 64 shard chains? Will each project have to choose a particular shard chain and stay only on that chain, or will transactions for any project be distributed across all shard chains?
Right. So the most immediately tangible version of ETH2 in which DeFi applications will exist on is likely one in which one single shard is what we think of Ethereum today. The rest are shard chains as data. 1 to 4 megabytes per second of data availability to the core system. In this context, this initial context immediately supports and enhances applications that scale with layer 1 data, such as all the rollups that people are talking about. And so something that we could see in the kind of medium term is for a lot of DeFi applications to exist on highly scalable rollup environments. So maybe even like a DeFi rollup where people are just like doing what we think of as DeFi on Ethereum today, but in a much more scalable context in this like layer 2 chain using all the sharded data. So that's kind of like immediately a potential path. But once execution and accounts and contracts are enabled on some set of shards, whether that be 2, 12, 32 or all 64, in this new context, applications are not load balanced by the core of the system. The consensus complexity for any type of path to do this is massive and not necessarily even tractable, in my opinion. Essentially putting like an OS scheduler in here blows up complexity massively. And one of the things that we try to avoid in this already very sophisticated consensus mechanism is consensus complexity, because we don't want to see accidental hard forks. It also just makes it 10 times harder to build. So we do expect this notion of like economic load balancing, where I deploy applications where it seems appropriate for me. And that's kind of like a hand wavy thing, but there's going to be emergent behavior. Like if there's tons of DeFi applications that like all live next to each other, it might be a like higher fee zone, but it might be worth for me to deploy an application there because that's where I want to be. Or if I'm like building out something else that's like relatively isolated, it's maybe like a contract between me and like the small business owners, and it pretty much like helps me distribute funds to them and helps them have like a little bit more liquidity on selling their stuff. Like I have no need necessarily to be in this like DeFi zone. Again, everything I'm talking about is just like potential emergent behavior, but we're also going to have to see to leverage the cross shard capabilities, we're going to see new emergent standards. For example, the ERC20, we might see an ERC 2020, where instead of this notion of like having balances embedded in the single contract, tokens might actually be a derivative contract of the parent contract, where if I hold the coins, I'm not holding like the reference to my balance in this big contract. I'm holding a contract that is the coins referencing the big contract. And this contract that is my coins, I might then be able to actually move across shards. So this notion of like, although everything's kind of grounded over here, I might be able to take my coins and I want to interact in a DeFi application on shard 10. So I move from shard 2 to shard 10 with my coins, and I do something over there. And so there will be modified standards that begin to kind of take this expanded scope in. When ETH1 is integrated into ETH2, DeFi will continue operating exactly as it does today in this like single shard paradigm. But like I said, you're going to give developers a bunch of new toys, aka shards and cross shard capabilities, and they're going to start playing with it. And so the emergent DeFi ecosystem across shards is going to grow and change. The current DeFi ecosystem will exist as long as there is demand for it to exist. But I imagine as people begin to leverage more and more of like the extended capabilities of ETH2, you're going to see new standards, you're going to see new types of DeFi applications, and new ways to kind of think about and interact with the system as a whole.
How will communication happen between shard chains, and will this slow down or create a lag in transaction speed?
So cross-shard communication in the optimistic can happen in a single slot. This is 12 seconds. So if I'm just trying to move assets from an account on shard A to account on shard B, it's going to be like similar latency to what I experienced today. It's essentially like a block time or a block time times 2. So in that like 12 to 24 seconds range. But when I start doing cross-shard applications that have increasing complexity, where maybe I have to hit shard A hit shard B, shard B hit shard C. Every time I'm making that jump, I'm inducing like a 12-second latency. If I'm using strictly layer 1 communication. There are a number of paths that have like a notion of optimistic execution where I can make claims about what will happen and actually have like derivative assets and conditional things about what will happen. And this is stuff that we've done actually a lot of research into this, especially when cross-shard communication was expected to happen on the 6-minute time horizon. This stuff was like very important. This stuff still exists. It's less important with the communication happening on a 12-second time horizon, but even then, if we can have paths that reduce effective latency for users, I think we're going to. And so eventually I expect there to be all sorts of like fun layer 2 tricks to allow for optimistic evaluation and to have like a seemingly instant cross-shard communication on certain types of applications. But on layer 1, we're going to see this like 12-second latency between communications. And there's going to be, there's also this notion of like yanking where assuming I own some sort of like asset or contract, for example, the ERC 2020, where I actually own the contract that is just the coins rather than the entire contract, I have the rights to move these around. And so if I'm going to be doing a lot of things with the coins that need to be on shard B, I'm just going to move them to shard B and then have like this immediate communication rather than having to induce additional latency. So there's going to be a number of ways to interact and operate, but naively, yes, you do when you communicate across shards, there's an additional latency. So the design space is huge. People are going to mess with it. People are going to do some really cool stuff, but there is complexity and some latency induced by it.
User Repexity has a couple of questions regarding the beacon chain and sharding. It was decided in 2018, I think, that delaying proof of stake launch to focus on making proof of stake and sharding launch at the same time was a better use of everyone's time. Seeing multiple and continued delays in the launch of phase 0, which won't even have true sharding functionality due to lack of ability to move your ETH, what is your hindsight view on this? I don't know if the question is clear enough.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
So the hybrid proof of work, proof of stake stuff. I used to work on a lot on that. I did a lot of work on the contract development. I wrote the EIP that was ultimately deprecated and was beginning to coordinate with clients to get that to mainnet. The path was harder than expected. But I think that hybrid proof of work, proof of stake in that environment on the existing chain was going to be at best a temporary kind of kludge that would have been probably nice for the community because they would have had the notion, it would have started to be able to stake early. But I think ultimately, if we wanted to get Ethereum to the vision of being like a scalable decentralized platform that can handle like the throughput that the world is going to demand, we had to take a more radical path. And I think the way that it was handled, that was kind of me early on in me beginning to interact with client teams and interact on all core devs. I think it could probably been handled better. I think that we showed up on an all core dev call and we're like, we're going to drop it without really thinking much about the implications. This is, again, me being naive, not thinking about the implications that it was going to have on the community. But I stand today. I think it was the right decision. I honestly, looking back at the design, there were some issues in building out phase 0 and building out the beacon chain and working through some of the stuff on a longer time horizon. And actually, with a recent paper that we co-authored with Yan Zhang on the consensus mechanism, we actually found, like 5 months ago, we found something critical in the design that was in the previous design in hybrid proof of work, proof of stake. And so thank fucking God that we didn't launch that without having like gone through this process, honestly. So like, it was a hard decision. I know we let people down. I know, and it sucks. I know that some people attribute some of like the price decline to that decision, which also sucks. I don't know if that's actually true. But it was a hard decision. I'm very confident in the path that we've taken, and we found a critical bug 5 months ago that would have been in production. So I'm glad we went this path.
The size of a full sink is ever growing, and when full ETH 2.0 launches, is going to become much more worse. I know pruning has been discussed before. Is it actively being worked on? Do you have an opinion on it? Do you have any other ideas?
Yeah. Okay. So first and foremost, in ETH2 design, we have this new notion of state. That's the core system state, the beacon chain state, and this is actually relatively bound. Even in the case where you have like 4 million validators validating, which is like all the ETH in existence, which is totally not feasible, really, and that isn't actually going to happen. But even in that case, the state size is bound at like half a gig, and so that's really good news. We've introduced this new like sophisticated mechanism, but it doesn't have unbounded growth. So step one, good. Step two is, I guess you mentioned pruning. This would probably be more what people usually call state rent, where portions of the state. So essentially, when you transition a block, you have this like big implicit input. You have the block and you have all the state. What state rent does and what pruning does is, instead of the second input being all the state, it's the subset of the state that people have paid for recently. And if people want to access portions of the state that people haven't been paid for recently, they'd have to be revived, like paid to go back into this active state. Because everything's based on a Merkle tree. Even if you're pruning portions of the Merkle tree, you can always like show up with the portions you prune and prove that they were there to begin with. So nothing's ever like totally lost with respect to the system, but it's like a totally different design as we have in ETH today, in terms of like how things are paid for, in terms of like contracts breaking and how developers had to think about stuff. And Alexei spent a lot of time. Alexei works on TurboGeth and Stateless Ethereum and other things. He spent a lot of time working on this, and went through many design iterations, and ultimately was like, this is a nightmare. This is going to be a nightmare for existing applications and devs, and this is going to break our notion of what Ethereum is supposed to be. Whether you could do that from day zero state rent, that's another question. But whether we can do it now, the assessment was really like, this is probably highly infeasible to actually integrate into Ethereum now. And so the other path that's been taken is this path called Stateless Ethereum. And this is a different design that keeps things feeling like they do on Ethereum today, but change some of the inner workings so that not everyone has to store all the state at all times, and such that when I run that state transition function, that like transition from block A to block B, instead of needing block B and all the state, I just need block B, because block B actually comes with all the portions of state that it needs to transition itself. And so I can follow the chain without actually having all of the state. If I just have all the blocks, I have all the proofs that I need to actually transition and understand the state, and follow the head of the chain, and to be able to make proofs about the head of the chain. And so this is nice because now not all nodes need to store all the state. And so as state grows, I can actually become shades of stateful. Whereas maybe there's certain types of accounts, certain contracts that I want to serve and that I want to know about. Maybe I'm a server. I like serve data about Maker. And so I just follow the Maker contracts, and I follow some other DeFi contracts that like use Maker. And anywhere that Maker tokens are touching, I follow that state. So I can serve it to people and I can understand it, I can analyze it. But any other portions of state, I just like disregard, because I can follow the chain without keeping all the state. And so I get this optionality of being like any degree of stateful that I choose. Whereas block producers, if I'm a miner, I'm probably storing the entire state, because I want to be able to optimize including any types of transactions and providing the proofs about the state related to the transactions. So this is Stateless Ethereum. This is this big movement. A lot of like the ETH1X R&D right now, which is kind of led by Piper and Alexei and some other people. It's very exciting. I'm super pumped that like people want to get some of these like major changes into Ethereum today. I think it's super healthy. I think this is like the revival of like intense research on Ethereum outside of just the ETH2 stuff is great and super exciting. This is to bring Stateless Ethereum to Ethereum today, and to pave the way for Stateless Ethereum being core inside of ETH2. And what this does is it allows ETH2 to stay very thin at its core. So you only have that beacon state, which is really I said max like 500 megs, but really it's more in the range of like 50. So 50 megabytes. And then based on that, I follow the beacon chain. And from there, I can follow any shard chain because they're now stateless. And I can make proofs from this like core beacon chain about anything in the rest of the system. So stateless Ethereum, I know there's another question about this. Stateless Ethereum is, for the current vision of ETH2, very important because it allows for validators to be able to quickly jump onto shards and validate just subsections of the shards and like attest to the validity and availability of these shard blocks, which is very important. And if without stateless Ethereum, we can still have Ethereum integrated into ETH2, but we now have the burden of the ETH2 state on all validators. And so I imagine that in a world in which we don't have stateless Ethereum on ETH2, we probably only have execution on some small subset of shards because that's going to put a bound on that. That's going to be disk size that all validators are going to have. And in that case, we're probably going hard into rollups, which is cool. I'm excited about them. And less so into like layer one state execution. So there's a lot there. Yes, we think about state size and state growth and issues there. Stateless Ethereum is a very viable path. I'm very excited about this. There's still some things to figure out. A lot of this is more on the like R&D side, like prototyping and proving out some basic ideas that we have rather than on like core research. So that's good. A lot of the problems are solved in some respect. But we need to see some like solid movement and likely a deploy on Ethereum before we can make the ultimate decision that it's going to be the path. And if we don't have this as a viable path, it will change what ETH2 ultimately looks like. But ETH2 can still exist without it. It can still integrate ETH1 without it, but it makes some of the core validation heavier, which is not great, and it makes it such that extending execution and state onto all shards is probably not viable on like the medium-term horizon. There are other things like zero-knowledge proofs and stuff that if we can't get stateless Ethereum right, that probably in like the 4-year time horizon we can integrate, but that's not what we're looking at today.
Is it Eth2.0 your idea of a final state? As far as this is a two-part question. So is it your idea of a final state? And the second part of the question is, as far as I know, it isn't quantum secure. Is there a plan to move to a more IOTA style of chain sometime in the future, or is that too far out for the foundation to be looking at right now?
So yes, if you talk to Justin or Vitalik, they talk about Ethereum 3.0 every once in a while, where Ethereum 3.0 is probably you take Eth2.0 and you replace like every component you possibly can with Starks. Starks are like Snarks, but they're quantum secure. They're larger in proof size, but I think they're more efficient to evaluate. And again, they are quantum secure. So they provide this like outlet to any time that you actually needed to do computation to validate and check on things. Instead, you can just take proofs from somebody else that the computation was done correctly. And in doing so, you can like at the cost of complexity, because these things, at least today, are very complex. But you can swap out a lot of the components for Starks for efficient verification, and some of the things that we do today that are not quantum secure. For example, BLS signatures and the aggregation that we use from them, the signature aggregation, we could do also with Starks. And so they're a path for making ETH2 more scalable and a path for swapping out the components that are not quantum secure for quantum secure components. So certainly all components of ETH2 have been designed and selected such that there is a known quantum secure component that can be swapped out with it on the like 5, honestly maybe 10-year time horizon. It depends on kind of the development of in this zero knowledge land and how quickly these things become not only feasible, not only possible in contracts, but like solid enough to really integrate into core consensus. And another fun thing about Starks, they're quantum secure. They have slightly different properties than Snarks, and they don't require a trusted setup, which is also a little bit more palatable for our layer 1 applications.
Going back to the first part of the question, so is ETH 2.0 your idea of a final state, or do you just mentioned the 5 to 10 year horizon? Do you see this as a natural progression then?
So it's probably there's a lot of talk about like the value of base layer ossification, and just getting it to a place where it is good enough to handle enough throughput and it's extensible enough that people can just build on it, and we don't have to like mess with layer 1 anymore, because messing with layer 1 comes with all sorts of like political issues, governance issues, all that kind of stuff. So I'd rather get to a place where it's solid and we're not messing with it anymore. I do think that especially in the quantum secure zone that we should let it be known today that the intention is to swap out XYZ components with quantum secure components and kind of have that on the horizon. In terms of building out, in terms of like another major upgrade to some like Ethereum 3, I think at least for me, you'd have to convince me that it was really important and that what we've built with E2 is not sufficient. In my understanding, especially in the context of layer 2 applications built on a highly scalable layer 1, like I think that we're going to be pretty good for a long time. That said, depends on who you talk to on when the quantum revolution is coming. So we don't want to get caught with our pants down.
User Bob Rossi, he asks a couple of questions, but I'll just read his questions, but it's basically one big question. How much internet data is expected to be used if you stake? It's a question basically for those who have kept data on home internet. Should we be concerned? And then second part of the question is, will the internet data use grow in a linear fashion? Like if I stake 2 nodes, will it use twice the internet data compared to 1 node?
Right. I've been meaning to write down an estimate on. I can do a back of the envelope estimate on data. My back of the envelope estimates from many months ago are that your regular home connection will certainly be sufficient for running a small number of validators.
Wait, is this home in North America or what? When you refer to regular home?
No, you're right. I think so. Probably in most of the world. But I will say the nuance here is probably not, especially on the order of like 1 to 4 validators. So that's 32 to 128 ETH. The problem is almost certainly not going to be your total bandwidth. It's going to be the quality, the consistency of the connection. I'd be much more worried about internet providers that go down frequently, or routers and other things that go down frequently, rather than total bandwidth for home hobbyist level staking.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there was a second thing that I want to ask. Is there a difference between staking 2 nodes on 1 machine versus 1 node on 2 machines? Is that does that use more or less internet data?
Yeah. So there's this like kind of split between components of the protocol. One, like the node and what people often call a beacon node or an ETH2 node, that's like the full implementation of the protocol. That's like running Geth, but not running a miner. Whereas running a validator is kind of like running a miner in conjunction with the protocol. So I have like the protocol, it follows the beacon chain, it does like the core stuff, it like makes sure everything looks good, like it's just following the Ethereum chain today. Once I add a validator, I add this like little small signing piece of software that sits in conjunction with the implementation of the protocol, the beacon node. And this actually tells the beacon node to do some extra things, follow some extra stuff, and to broadcast messages every once in a while. And so the node itself is going to exhibit some amount of bandwidth requirement just to follow the chain. This is primarily going to be in the form of just following beacon blocks, which are like 20 to 50 kilobytes that happen every 12 seconds. That is so you do, by running a node, you have some baseline bandwidth requirements. So if I run 2 nodes, I now have both of those baseline bandwidth requirements. Whereas if I run a single node and I attach a handful of validators, say 4 validators to it, the base of the bandwidth requirements doesn't go up. But each time I attach a validator, there's additional duties that they have to do on the network with respect to different shards. And so there's different subnets, as we call them, different like subsections of the full network that they have to follow to be able to do their job. And so in the range of adding, I think, up to like 2,000 validators, your bandwidth requirements, especially into phase one, will scale approximately linearly off of that baseline we had. So we have the baseline protocol, and then we'll have like linear bandwidth requirements. Eventually, when you're following all subnets all the time, there is a max amount of bandwidth to follow everything all the time. And in that case, your bandwidth requirements on listening are going to be capped at some point. There is another type of bandwidth when you say you have like 20,000 validators on a single machine, which is insane. I hope none of you do that. You would have to like so 20,000 divided by 32, every slot at like a single instance of time, you'd have to blast out like 600 messages. And so your outgoing bandwidth, no matter what, as you continue to add validators, is gonna scale linearly. And so there's a few different nuances in there. I should probably write about it more because I think it's time. People are concerned. People want to know about this stuff. So I'll see if we can publish some better information on that.
But basically the takeaway right now for most of the people in most parts of the world is that the limit or the bottleneck is not really the internet speed or data speed, but it's the availability of or the possibility of an internet connection failing or going down.
Correct. So if the internet slowing you down might make your messages late, which at the very worst is going to make you make like 3/4 of the rewards that you would have. So if you can get an attestation disseminated to the network in an epoch, in that 6-minute time, even if you're kind of making decisions slowly, you can still be profitable and you can still be helpful to the network. I suggest that you get a better connection, but you will not be losing money in that case. It's really, if you go offline and you go offline a lot, that's gonna really eat into you a lot more than a slow network connection. But I know I did a little bit of hand waving on your internet connection being good enough. So we'll try to get some benchmarks out there for you all so that you can make better decisions.
All right. So user Swenny Met asks, once phase 0 is launched, can we then enable the testnet max transfers? I hope I pronounced this correctly, the function.
Yeah. So we, as I mentioned earlier, max transfers was initially set to 0. That's when transfers still existed in the spec. They've been removed for like 8 months. So no, those won't be on a testnet initially. Like I said, I think this is an ongoing conversation, which I think will likely take place a little bit on the specs repo, certainly on Discords, and maybe in the notion of people like proposing EIPs to add transfers. So ongoing conversation. It's not going to hit a technical test net in the next 5 months. Yeah,
I wasn't aware that the max transfers referred to what we talked about earlier. So
we have a number of operations. The primary you'd think of would be like attestations and deposits. These are like messages included on chain, and there's a maximum number that can be included in each block. And so initially, max transfers existed, but max transfers was set to 0, and then could be turned on by turning that number up. But like I said, it's not in there right now.
User Lightfoot has 2 questions, and so we're finally getting to the staking centralization. His first question is, as companies like Coinbase are offering staking without the opportunity cost of ETH or rewards being locked in until phase 2 for a 25% fee, by the way, Bitcoin Swiss, I think, is offering 15 or 20%, so something in that order of magnitude. Is staking Eth2.0 objectively the best financial use of 32 ETH, or is the network going to be relying on enthusiasts staking on as a passion project?
It's going to be a mix. I won't sit here and give you financial advice. I think that there's a lot of risk associated with this thing. I think there's some technical prowess that you need, and I think that it's a non-trivial decision to stake your ETH. And this isn't a network that expects 99% participation, whereas I think we see in some of these networks that allow like delegation and things. ETH is as they say, money. ETH is used as collateral in other applications, and ETH is going to be used to secure the network. And so, like, there's a lot of stuff you can do with your ETH. Make an informed decision, read a lot, run test nets, and make a decision. It's not my decision. I don't know if it's the best use of your money. And obviously, if 20 million ETH shows up, then like all of a sudden it's a lot less of a good decision because the rewards are going to be lower. So check it out. In terms of the exchanges, I do expect exchanges to show up. I do expect exchanges and staking providers to have a significant impact. But I know that the ethos of decentralization and the hobbyists and the fact that running a few validators is like actually relatively cheap in a home setup. I do expect there to be a kind of a hobbyist fervor and for there to be like a significant hobbyist element on the net. There are anti-correlation incentives. If you're a big staking provider and you have 20% of the network and you go offline all at once, like you're going to lose more money than if you were just a hobbyist that went offline, like relatively isolated. If you're a big staking provider and you have a bug and you do something slashable, like you're going to lose a lot more money than if I'm running 4 validators at home, I have a bug and I do something slashable. And so there are anti-correlation incentives. The staking providers are aware of them, and the staking providers, at least some of them, relatively kind of ish want to be good citizens. So some of this stuff, I really hope that education allows for a healthy distribution of validators across hobbyists and nodes, as well as staking providers. If I want to go to a staking provider, maybe I'm just not going with Coinbase. Maybe I'm going with somebody that has like 5% of the network instead of 15% of the network. And in doing that, I can create like a better healthy distribution across the network. And if we don't do that, and we have like a mega staking provider that has a huge portion of the network, it'll probably be fine for some amount of time. And then one of these tail risk scenarios is going to happen and someone's going to lose a lot of money. And then we're all going to learn. I'm telling you to learn now before we do it. But then we're all going to learn. And then we're going to have a better distribution. So, it's going to be a push and pull. It's going to be a tug. They're going to have some good features. But we're trying to make staking at home as easy as possible. We're trying to make staking, on not just AWS as easy as possible. And we're also experimenting. There's a couple grants out for like decentralized staking pools. There's a lot of options, and explore them and make an informed decision.
So from my perspective, I can set up a Raspberry Pi, run my own validator, but that's the limit of my technical ability. But basically, what I understand from what you're saying is that the barrier to entry for staking by yourself might be higher compared to a staking pool, but the tail risk or the hidden risks are actually it's you don't really know what you're getting yourself into, or you might not be aware of the tail risks when you go through a central staking provider as compared to staking by yourself or running your own validator.
There are certainly tail risks built into the economics of the protocol that would disincentivize you from running with the biggest staking provider, running on the same cloud everyone else is, running the same client software that everyone else is running. Like if there's 60% running client X, then like there's more risk associated with running client X if something bad happens to client X. And so there are anti-correlation disincentives. If the world is perfect, we won't feel them almost ever because the chain's just going to run well. But in these tail risk scenarios, if you are running with majority X, Y, or Z, you're gonna potentially feel these tail risks more than somebody who's running with a minority setup.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me just quickly check the clock because we still have quite a few questions left. So
I talk too much.
No, it's fine, and we just started with the most upvoted questions, so it's kind of meritocratic, but still. Let's see. There were one more question on the staking pool centralization. At what point would you consider any? I mean, it's a hard question to ask, but you mentioned like 20% or 20 million ETH. Mm-hmm. Is there? No, I have two questions. So one, is there a specific point at which we should start paying attention? And secondly, have you written or will you write more about these anti-correlation incentives?
So on the anti-correlation incentives, I believe if Carl hasn't written about them in his like staking Ethereum blog series, I think it's called Staked. If he hasn't written about them yet, He should. So they're there, but if they're not there, I'm going to talk to him right after this call, and we're going to write that post.
Yeah, it would be
What was-
it would be great for us in the community to refer to this, just to give people a quick point of referral, like just be
Absolutely.
aware of the risk you're taking.
And I've been talking with ETH recently, and they do intend to have like a whole section to help hobbyists understand risks, understand client software, understand kind of all the different little pieces. So I hope that they actually in the next like month or so become a really strong resource. So that would also be a place that hopefully we can point them to soon. What was the other part of the question?
At what point, percentage-wise or
Right.
each
So
stake, should we pay attention?
1/6 is the red flag. 1/3 becomes theoretically enough to cause a network fault, but that would be under incredibly contrived situation. If 1/3 could split the other two 1/3s in half into two different networks and not allow them to talk to each other, and only in this super contrived way, then they could like double finalize something and do it like a double spend or something like that. That is incredibly contrived. It's almost like 100% unrealistic that a 1/3 attacker could also have such granular control over the P2P network. Once you get into that 50% range, you start hitting like certain double spend and double finality attacks become like much more feasible. Being able to like manipulate the network becomes more feasible. Being able to manipulate the fork choice becomes more feasible. At like a 2/3, you're really just like you're the mob. You're just in control of everything. And in that case, if there's like a 2/3 cartel, we're probably as a community just gonna give them the middle finger and like fork them out and say we're gonna go on our way. But I don't think we're gonna have to get there. But honestly the threat and risk of certain of these like type of social maneuvers even just existing, I think dissuades a lot of them from actually happening. Yeah, so those are the numbers. In terms of slashing risk, the percentage of funds that you lose scale with the percentage of the network that has recently done something slashable times 3. So if I'm like 0.1% of the network and I do something slashable, then I lose 1 ETH. I get a slap on my wrist. They say, bad, you did a bad job. You lose 1 ETH. And you also then lose the recent percentage slashable times 3. So if nobody else has done something slashing recently, which like we expect slashings to be very rare, you would lose an additional 0.03% of your ETH. So like that, your percentage times 3. Whereas if I'm, 1/3, I'm 1/3 of the network. Now I'm 33% of the network, and I done something slashable. I have like faulty software, or I did something actually malicious. I'm going to lose 33% times 3. So I'm going to actually lose maximally. And it's tuned that way such that if enough of the network attacked such that they could create a network fault, as I said, that 1/3 is the theoretical initial there, then they're maximally punished. And so in the case that I'm a Coinbase and I'm running 40% of the network and I, God forbid, have a software bug, I'm not even doing something malicious, or somebody hacks my system and gets me to sign a bunch of malicious messages, then all of a sudden I'm losing all my money, right? If I'm staking with a provider there. Whereas if I'm staking with a 3% network provider, then I'm going to lose 9% of my money, but that's a lot better than 100.
There were a couple of questions on stakers validators exiting by phase 2. So let me just read this one. As I understand, there will be a queue for validators who wish to exit to avoid a mass drop of validators, but by phase 2 there will probably be a lot staked and rewarded ETH waiting to be withdrawn so that the queue will be big. Will increased validator rewards be sufficient in hampering speculative and staker sell pressure at that time? Basically, can you explain the situation and what you have designed?
So there's an activation and an exit queue. This is for security purposes, such that the validator set cannot change too quickly. When the validator set changes very quickly, then all of a sudden validators can potentially sign like slightly historic messages that were slashable and not get punished because they already exited. And so reducing the churn in the validator set is kind of a security parameter. And so activations, this is why, even once your deposit is processed, you're not necessarily activated immediately if you've been messing with the test nets, because there's this activation queue. I know there's not a great visualization on the block explorers right now, but it's something that's a high priority so that you're not just left in the dark, like saying like, I hope I'm going to be a validator soon. In the same way, there's also an exit queue. So I submit an exit. And when I submit an exit, the earliest I can be exited is like 4 epochs after I submit that exit on chain. And this is assuming there's no one in the queue. But if like, I think if like 100,000 validators exit at the same time, it takes like 9 months for everyone to exit. And this is, again, because of the security parameter. It also makes, in the case that like there's finality issues and there's like an ongoing attack on the chain, it makes it so it's not viable for you to just say, fuck this, I'm out. It makes you have to be like, okay, this is my job. How can we fix this? And which, obviously, like, it's my job too. I'm going to be trying to fix it. I'm trying to coordinate with people and trying to figure out the attack. Clients are going to be doing stuff. So I'm not saying it's like your job to actually debug the issue, but like, if there's issues on the chain, you can't just say, I'm out. You have to like, you're in it. Obviously the first guy who decides to be out, if there's no one in the execute, he can get out, but like, great job, dude. So anyway, so this is the exit queue. Once you do the exit queue, you're actually then you enter into a state called withdrawable. So you're sitting in there and you're withdrawable. There's no in phase 0. There's no place to withdraw to, and so in that case, you're just stuck in the state called withdrawable. The idea is that once you have state and execution integrated into ETH2, that you have withdrawable means that I can now move my ETH out of a validator and back into normal Ethereum account land. And so I think the question was, if we have a ton of people that have like gotten into this withdrawable state and then we enable execution all at once, are we going to have a huge liquidity problem where like we have mass selling on the market? I believe that wouldn't necessarily be the case. So for one, we're going to have, because of this exit queue mechanism, likely a ton of validators aren't going to actually exit before there's actually like the integration of state and execution on ETH2. Because if I enter in this exit and withdrawable state, my funds are just sitting there and they're not even actually working for me anymore. And so some people might use this, they just say, you know what, validating is not for me. I'm going to exit. Even though I'm not accruing, I'm locked up and I can't like get any rewards, I need to just exit. So some people might do that. So there might be some ETH that's like kind of sitting on the sidelines waiting for this liquidity event. But you have to remember that also like a ton of ETH is going to be, so now imagine there's people that are still validating up until this point of liquidity, but they haven't actually exited. So now if you have this like mass exit where like 100,000 validators, like 3 million ETH is trying to exit all at once, then you actually like it's going to take almost a year for all this to exit. So you also don't have this like insane dump, which again I think is highly unlikely that everyone's going to just want to exit at the same time. And another thing to consider is with this mechanism in general, we do expect over time for more and more ETH to be locked in this mechanism, especially as certain milestones are hit. As the integration of ETH1 and ETH2 happens, there's just less risk associated with validating at that point, more and more. So we actually expect more and more ETH to be locked. So we actually expect the ratio of ETH wanting to get in versus get out to actually be higher, than otherwise. So it's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that until you just asked me the question, but I don't really see, unless something like terrible happens where everyone's like, fuck this, there's like major bugs and like life sucks as a validator and everyone just like exited 10 months ago and wants to just get the hell out. Unless that happens, then I don't really expect there to be an issue. And if that happens, like we have bigger issues on our hands anyway.
Will this be a thing? Excuse me if this is a stupid question, but will this queuing and exiting be something we'll be able to follow in real time or more or less have a view on?
Yeah. So I mentioned right now, I actually just joined the Witty testnet the other day, and I sent my deposit in, and then I'm like twiddling my thumbs. I'm like, is it happening? So I know there's some pain there. Proto from our team has been working on like a deposit tracker and visualizer, so I hope that's going to be out soon. And if you're Etherscan or Bitfly, the beacon chain guys, if you're listening to this, like having proper deposit monitoring, activation queue monitoring, and exit queue monitoring is like a huge feature. And if I were trying to get a competitive advantage on my competitor, I would integrate that soon.
Danny, quick question: how much more time do you have, just for me to know what questions to pose you?
I'm good. I mean, at least 20 minutes.
All right, great. So there is a thing I forgot to ask you on the previous topic with the centralization of the staking pools or exchanges. There was a discussion on the Ethereum Foundation and its role that they could or should play as a centralized staking provider or whatever. What are your thoughts on this? Is this a good track to think about or have a discussion about?
Mm-hmm. So a few things there. First and foremost, we don't have the expertise to do that. That's not what we do. We do run, obviously, like we're security experts, we're protocol experts, all that kind of stuff, but like we don't run thousands of nodes. Like we run boot nodes, like it's just not what we do, and it's not what we want to do. If you look at any of the talks about the Ethereum Foundation, we're looking for we have this like ethos of subtraction. We're trying to enhance and enable the community rather than like build out the Ethereum Foundation as this like behemoth. And so in that, just like that core philosophy, we're really not like looking to add new scopes of like sophisticated things that we do under our umbrella. Second of all, like, you know, I certainly understand staking providers, institutional stakers, decentralized staking pools. All these are going to be, they're all going to exist. They're all going to play a big role. But it's not something like, at the end of the day, if I'm doing anything at the Ethereum Foundation, I'm trying to encourage and enhance the hobbyists and like decentralize this process as much as possible. And so I understand like bringing some stuff in-house to the Ethereum Foundation feels like maybe more decentralized than if Coinbase is doing it. But at the end of the day, like we don't want to have our finger on the trigger. Like we don't want to be the ones that like have enough stake to be able to attack this thing. Like it's not in our ethos. And we're going to work towards creating mechanisms to help decentralize this thing more rather than like fight the centralized entities by, you know, playing their own game. So yeah, it's almost certainly not something that's going to happen.
Yeah. So
we're gonna be running some nodes. Like I got some hardware in the mail right now. I'm gonna be running some nodes at home. But I'm not gonna be, you know, we're not gonna be running, 100,000 ETH of community funds.
Yeah, so same argument goes for, say, consensus. So the argument isn't that there are some kind of quote unquote trusted foundations or companies as opposed to, say, Coinbase or other exchanges. The perspective that you're taking is we should just incentivize or disincentivize the accumulation of or the existence of large pools, whether they be Coinbase, Foundation, consensus, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, agreed. And, you know, Consensus is going to run their staking as a service provider, and they'll probably do a good job, and they'll probably be good, good stewards and custodians. But at the end of the day, like there's risk associated with having too much, and we're going to try to make it so that it's not attractive to do so.
User Set in Mind asks, how will EIP 1559 be incorporated into ETH2?
Mm-hmm. So if you look at the phase 1 specs today, there's a very similar mechanism that already exists where when I create a shard block, and that shard block is cross-linked. I've been chosen to be the proposer on shard 10 for slot 362. I make that block. That block is of a certain size. At first, it's just looking at the size of the data because without execution, that's the cost of it on the system. And there's a fee burn associated with that. The production of that block. So once I get that block cross-linked into the beacon chain, I take a hit. And so I have to pay a fee burn to do that. And so there is, for me to actually want to make that shard block, it needs to be profitable. And so I know what the fee burn is going to be, and so I need to make sure that it is worth my time to make the shard block. Otherwise, I wouldn't even make it. And so this mechanism, this EIP 1559, is native to ETH2 and will be. And so even if I really hope to see 1559 on Ethereum mainnet soon, but if it is not by the time that ETH1 is integrated in ETH2, it's just going to be native to the core consensus in there. So I think that's a big win for us.
User Vedran asks, are there intentionally malicious clients running on phase 0 testnets? If so, who's writing them?
So we are like tracking. One of the most obvious malicious behaviors is slashing, doing slashable things. So like double signing attestations or trying to make 2 blocks at the same time. These behaviors we are inducing every once in a while just to make sure that they're being caught, and they are. You can go check out on witty.beaconchain.in. You can check out the slashings. There are people that are getting slashed, and that's primarily actually us just like running 2 instances of our software and getting them to sign bad messages. So we are inducing some nefarious behavior, but we are also at the same time we're building out a suite of tools to better monitor and better disrupt networks. You can check out Proto Lambda's rumor tool. It's like a very thin kind of networking entity that runs almost all of the networking protocol, and so it can kind of be embedded in the network. And we're going to do some cool stuff where we try to like DOS people and like split networks and stuff with these little tools. So it's in the works. And something that I would like to see, if anybody's interested, is somebody take one of the validator clients from one of the teams and make it an evil client. Make it do on command evil things like double signing messages and stuff. Because messing around with that would be fun. It's something that's kind of on my to-do list, but hasn't made it in the works yet. Beyond that, so we're going to have these like large-scale multi-client testnets. You're seeing smaller versions of them right now that will be restarted a couple times before we do and you can join these, but before we do a large-scale full-blown multi-client testnet where we get thousands of participants across the community. We're gonna have that relatively soon. But in parallel, we're actually probably going to say there's three like really viable clients. Depends on the day on that estimate, but suppose there's 3. We'll take a medium-sized testnet, maybe like 400, maybe 300 nodes distributed across the world with say 20,000 validators on them, evenly split across these clients. And we're gonna leave these nets up, and this is gonna be our version of the incentivized nets, where we, rather than incentivizing just trying the network out, because I think honestly we're going to have a lot of that. We're going to have a lot of the community just like plugging in, making attestation, making blocks. I hope that maybe POAP will get in on this and provide some NFTs, maybe even for like finding slashings and things. So there's some like baseline. I think we're going to get a lot of baseline activity on these like larger multi-client testnets. Whereas this thing, we're going to create like this attack net where we're going to provide the stability, and you can join with some amount of validators, I guess, to get some of the incentivization, like the max in validators, and we'll define in. But we'll have this just like stable attack net up that you can receive some bounties and stuff for successfully attacking it. So taking maybe some of the rumor tools and trying to partition the network. Like if you can prove that you disrupted finality for 5 epochs, then there might be a reward. Or if you can craft messages that it drops all of the client A, it crashes all of those nodes on this network, then you can get a reward. And so we are messing with nefarious agents on the networks today. We want to see a lot more of it, and we're going to incentivize you to do it too.
Blockchain on Chain asked, how do software upgrades work once proof of stake is deployed? Will validators signal support?
There will not likely be a native. So software upgrades, there's a native mechanism built in called the fork that's built into the beacon chain that allows for really clean forking and upgrades. And it's something that we're going to be experimenting, making sure this mechanism works on test nets before we launch. Upgrades, I think, largely are going to be driven. Upgrades to start are largely going to be driven by following the current roadmap, which is bringing shards in phase 1 and bringing a phase 1.5 integration of ETH1 and ETH2 as soon as possible. And a lot of this I expect to be largely not contentious and not really need like a strong signaling mechanism. Certain things, there's this notion of graffiti. So there's a 32 byte field in in beacon blocks, and this could be co-opted to be used for signaling, for validator signaling. So if there was, and maybe it'd be fun to like experiment with it, we could just like vote on something trivial to start and just get people to like signal in this mechanism. It's similar to the extra data field in Ethereum today. But for example, if there was like what seemed like a contentious EIP to add transfers, before a phase 1.5, and then I think that the graffiti could serve as a valuable signaling mechanism, similar to a lot of other things. We have coin votes, we have Twitter debates, we have Reddit polls, we have so this you can add it to the gambit of signaling mechanisms.
Bob Rossi asks, is there any indication we can expect a Raspberry Pi 4 to last all the way through phase 2?
Yes, I think that. So again, I talked about earlier. There's this notion of like the protocol, and then there's the notion of like this little signing entity called the validator. The baseline protocol of just following the beacon chain and being able to say follow a single shard, whichever one you choose. I do believe that a Raspberry Pi 4 would be able to do this. In terms of validating, when I add a validator, I induce some additional bandwidth. And so there's going to be a little bit more load because of that. And there's a little bit more computational load from signing. But the main thing is in phase 1, once I am a validator, there's some amount of shard chain. I store 1/32 of a shard chain, of 2 weeks of a shard chain. That's my duty for every validator I have. And so there's going to be this disk requirement that doesn't exists in phase 0 that's going to come with phase 1. And so a Raspberry Pi, and I don't have a good estimate on what that disk requirement looks like. You're right, I can figure it out real quick. I need to look into it. But it's going to be on the order of like in the gig range per shard that you might need to store. And so all of a sudden, I need to make sure that I have some disk associated and available for my validator duties. Again, if I'm just running the protocol and I'm not being a validator, I certainly expect that you can run the beacon chain and some small number of shards on that type of hardware. In the event that you're a validator, you do have additional requirements, especially in the range of this like persistent disk requirement, which I believe you could plug in and make it run. We're going to be experimenting with this. This is definitely a design goal. I wouldn't say that. I can't come out and say today that like it's the best thing you should do. Like getting a machine that costs $250 instead of $50 might be a good decision. But at the end of the day, I do believe it's going to be feasible. And one thing that might be valuable, and if you haven't checked out Jim, I can't remember his last name. Jim McDonald. He's working on this staking as a service provider called Attestant. He was on the ETH Staker call recently, and he talked a lot about key management and structures between nodes and clients. And one thing that might actually be really valuable to do with a Raspberry Pi is like have your main node running on a larger machine. So like maybe an old laptop or home desktop, just something at home, and actually only run your validators on the Raspberry Pi. So put your keys, your hotkeys in the Raspberry Pi, only open up one port, only listen to one type of traffic coming in on that port from the node, and do all the signing in this like really isolated environment. So there's even if you're not running the full protocol on a Raspberry Pi, which I think is going to be possible, Raspberry Pis or other small dedicated devices might be interesting to bring into the mix regardless.
Tricky Troll asks, pineapple on pizza, yay or nay?
If it has bacon on it, then yes. I actually,
Oh Jesus, bacon and pineapple on pizza.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I'm not a big pizza eater, but for some reason, pineapple is just really good on pizza. I don't know why.
Okay, let's continue. 5 day old burrito asks, will there be an option to stake your staking returns? If I check Beacon Chain, I see the average validator balance is 32.3 ETH, but everything above 32 ETH is not staked, right? And he also asks whether this would lead to centralization, because if people actually have an option through a central staking party to restake their returns, well, will there be an option to just restake your staking returns if you run your own validator?
So at the point in which there's liquidity for validators, they will be you will be able to move ETH beyond that 32 effective balance, and in doing so, you could pull it out or you could move it on to other validators. And so, not today, but that is something that is in the works, because right now we keep validators at a max of 32 in their effective balance in like the way that they're contributing to the consensus, so that we can think of each validator as essentially the same balance and easily shuffle them across different parts of the system. And so in doing that, we forego the compounding of rewards beyond that 32, which is, it's certainly a trade-off, but having the ability to move those rewards out and do other things with them while still keeping your validator running, I think is the good compromise, and that's expected, at the point at which there's liquidity on the system.
Labrav asked, and I think we touched on this, so just feel free to glance over it. Having the critical mass of ETH to stake at the very beginning might be an issue. Is there any place where pledges of big ETH holders like the foundation that plan to stake are collected beforehand to ease this problem? You said anecdotally that you feel like many people or organizations are waiting to start staking, but is there some kind of way to gauge this, to get a sense of the willingness?
Yeah, I mean, somebody could throw up a coin vote today, and if you're interested in it, I say, do it. I'll retweet it. It'd be interesting to see. I think that it's certainly non-binding, right? It shows that you have the ETH, but it doesn't actually show that it's going to end up in that contract. So it could be valuable. It could be interesting to check it out. If you have any gumption to try, go for it. The thing I'm worried about most is like this first mover problem. Say the deposit contract goes up and like nobody wants to be the first one to do it. So having some like larger, what do we call them, whales, who are willing to like make the first jump, I think would be valuable. So if you're a whale out there and you wanna make an impact, maybe make a big deposit at the beginning. But we'll see. I'm not too concerned about ETH showing up in that contract.
All right. Danny, 2 more questions. I think I had to skip a couple of questions, but you are very eloquent in your answers. So I'm pretty sure we actually answered everybody's questions. There are 2 more that I'd like to ask you. You just mentioned the deposit contract. Any thoughts on when the deposit ceremony will take place?
Very soon. We have an audit going out for this deposit CLI. If you checked out on, I retweeted this morning from Carl and our team, part of using the launch pad, which is what we want to be one of the primary gateways for hobbyists to do their initial deposits. It has this deposit CLI associated with it, and we're putting that out, and we're doing an audit of that over the next like 5 weeks. So that's pretty much the last hurdle, and I would expect it soon.
Final question. Do you have any parting advice, tips, things you would like to share with anyone listening to this in this moment in time?
So I have a big post coming out on Monday, like called the State of Eth2.0, and it's aimed at you guys. It's aimed at hobbyists, aimed at users to just kind of better understand what's happening, the framing. And one of the things that I talk about, I give a decent amount to talk about, is the multi-client paradigm. First of all, one, why we do it in ETH1 today and ETH2. Two, some of the complexities and issues that come with it, but also the the benefits that the network can have by seeing a healthy distribution across many different clients on the network, and really a call to action to not just use the most popular client, to try them all out, or at least try a couple, and help the network have more resilience by kind of embracing this multi-client paradigm. We have a number of really strong clients. There's not going to be, I know on Ethereum mainnet today, like there are increasingly some really good options, but like Geth is just like rock solid. But we have a number of rock solid clients that are coming out the gate. So like check them out, and embrace the multi-client paradigm, and like bring some additional value to the network through embracing that. And again, I have an article coming on Monday. You can check it out.
I think that would be a wonderful sticker for DEFCON 6, embrace the multi-client paradigm.
Yeah.
All right, Danny, I really enjoyed this. Thank you for making time. I will post this very soon, and I hope people enjoy it and learn something from it. Where can they reach out to you? Where can they follow you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Danny Ryan. I'm on GitHub, DJR2.0, and the ETH R&D Discord is really great. We have a lot of ETH2 discussions going on there. We have a little testnet interop area where we're talking about some of the ongoing things with the testnet, and the whole 1x initiative is also being discussed in there. I'll shout out to I think the ETH Hub guys have kind of revitalized and rebranded their Discord recently, where they're trying to engage more people on the hobbyist level talking about staking. So the ETH R&D Discord is like very technical. If you want to come in and like have some chats, we're always down. But it seems like this is the ETH Hub staking zone in their Discord is going to become like a really good place for people to chat about staking setups and hardware and just kind of share ideas. Obviously, and the R-ETH staker is also a great resource.
All right then, Danny, thank you so much. And would you maybe quick closing question? Would you be down to do another one of these in the future whenever we go
absolutely.
live? All right,
my pleasure. Thank you. I really appreciate it. There's a lot of, I know this is a huge project, and I know there's a lot of moving parts, and it can be kind of opaque to see what's going on. So it's my pleasure to help answer questions and enlighten.
All right. See ya, Danny.
Yeah. Take care, man. Appreciate it.